The Galactic Coalition needed 80 days to decide if exterminating humanity was acceptable. Admiral Sarah Miller decided they wouldn't even get 800 hours. The alarm blared at 4:29 a.m., but Admiral Sarah Miller was already awake. She was always awake. Sleep had become a luxury her body simply stopped requesting over the last 18 months. Ever since the Vrethan fleet's kinetic projectiles began raining down like hail across entire continents. Sarah sat on the edge of a folded cot in the back of Bunker Zeta 7, located 1,300 feet below what used to be the city of Denver. She held a cup of cold coffee between her hands, her eyes fixed on the concrete wall in front of her, when the alert system flashed reddish-orange and the duty operator shouted her name. She was on her feet before the echo of the shout could fade. "Report," she said, her voice the calm, level tone of someone who had learned to treat chaos as a second language. Colonel Marcus Reed spun in his chair, and Sarah knew immediately that this was different. It wasn't the usual nervousness that followed every new orbital detection or suspicious radiation pattern in the outer belt. It was something closer to shock, the look of a man staring at data that refused to be real. "Admiral," Reed said, "we've received a transmission. Wide-spectrum diplomatic channel, Galactic Coalition Class 2 encryption." Sarah paused. She looked at him for a second. "Put it on the main screen." The operations room of Bunker Zeta 7 was the size of 3 tennis courts and smelled permanently of hot metal, circuit oil, and the bad coffee that ran through the place like blood. 42 technicians, analysts, and operators manned stations arranged in curved rows around a central holographic platform. Above them, screens displayed feeds from surviving satellites, atmospheric data, orbital tracking, and a real-time map of what remained of human cities. What remained was painfully little. The central holographic projection flickered and then stabilized into a figure Sarah had never seen in person but recognized from dossiers, Ambassador Quelix Varung, a member of the Thalassari species. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, with skin like matte blue stone, and 4 eyes arranged in a semicircle, giving him a 360-degree field of vision. It was the first time a coalition representative had transmitted directly to the terrestrial command bunker. "Human administration," the ambassador's voice said, translated by the universal system with a smoothness Sarah found completely inappropriate for the moment. "The Galactic Coalition recognizes the ongoing situation in your solar system and reiterates its position of active neutrality. We are transmitting to inform you that the Vrethan aggregate has formally presented its resource extraction intentions to the full council. Deliberation will take approximately 80 local solar cycles." Sarah felt something that wasn't quite anger. It was colder than that. It was the recognition of a truth she already knew, but hearing it out loud made it absolutely and irrevocably concrete. 80 days. The coalition needed 80 days to decide if they thought exterminating humanity was acceptable. "We acknowledge the communication," she said, her voice flat. She cut the transmission. For a moment, no one spoke. The screens continued to flicker with data. Someone in some corner of the room was typing. "Reed," Sarah said. "Admiral, trigger the Lazarus Protocol. Final phase." The silence that followed was of a different quality. It was the silence of 42 human beings who had just understood that the game had changed. "Voice confirmation required," Reed said, his voice slightly tight. "Admiral Sarah Miller. Authorization code 7, Alpha, Lazarus, Memory, Resistance." She looked at the empty screen where the alien ambassador had been a moment before. "We remember everything," the system accepted. And somewhere above them, on the far side of the moon and in the hidden recesses of 3 separate asteroid belts, 14 years of secret work began to wake up. The story of the Lazarus Protocol began with a question asked by a man named Professor Elias Drummond 22 years earlier in a conference room at the Global Strategy Academy in Geneva. The question was simple. What if they aren't friendly? First contact had occurred 41 years ago. A Thalassari ship appeared in Jupiter's orbit without warning, transmitted a mathematical greeting signal for 72 hours, and then waited. Humanity, euphoric and terrified in equal measure, responded. What followed was a period of gradual, fascinating, and deeply asymmetrical integration. The galaxy was crowded, political, and extremely complicated. The Galactic Coalition, with its 47 founding members, had laws, treaties, jurisdictions, and an arbitration system that consumed time and resources on an astronomical scale. Humans were greeted with the polite condescension reserved for smart children showing up at an adult party, admired for their curiosity, tolerated for their energy, but never invited to sit at the main table. Full citizenship rights, equivalent to those of founding species, required 50 cycles of verified integration. Legal protection against third-party aggression required full member status. Full member status required completing 50 cycles of integration. The bureaucracy was a labyrinth designed by someone who never had to survive inside it. Drummond saw the pattern too early for anyone to take him seriously. The vulnerability isn't technological, he had said in that Geneva room, a holographic map of the Milky Way rotating slowly above the table. It's legal. If someone wants to attack us, they can simply argue that we aren't full members yet, and that therefore our objections have no legal weight. The coalition will deliberate, and we will die while that happens. It took 3 years to convince the right people. After that, it took 14 years of silent work, budgets hidden in satellite maintenance logs, engineers who were officially retired, and a network of underground and space facilities that appeared in records as nuclear waste dumps and asteroid monitoring stations. The result was a fleet, not the conventional fleet of patrol ships humanity officially maintained. Those 19 modest vessels the coalition inspected periodically with an air of bored approval. It was a real fleet. 1,400 warships, built on decades of intelligence gathered on alien technologies, improved with human engineering, and tested in simulations so elaborate that the pilots who participated in them developed a specific type of motion sickness doctors eventually named virtual warp syndrome. Sarah had been recruited for the Lazarus Protocol when she was a commander at age 34. Drummond, then 72 and in failing health, had sat across from her in a room without cameras and said simply, "Do you believe we can trust the galaxy to protect us?" She had thought for exactly 4 seconds. "No," she had replied. "Good," he said. "You've just been promoted." In Bunker Zeta 7, 3 hours after Ambassador Quelix Varun's transmission, Sarah stood before a holographic table with her 8 sector commanders in simultaneous conference. Faces from every continent, their eyes carrying the weight of 18 months of a war humanity had fought, for most of that time, just to survive. Commander Jane Park, responsible for the Asian sector, had a splint on her left wrist that had already been reset 3 times. Commander David Okonkwo from the African sector operated from a mobile command center that changed locations every 48 hours. Chief Engineer Maya Chen, who wasn't technically a sector commander but whom Sarah insisted on including because Maya understood quantum propulsion like others understood breathing, was present via a video link with a 2-second delay, transmitting from inside one of the lunar facilities that had just entered full activation mode. "We have a window?" Sarah said. She didn't say which window, because everyone in the room knew. The coalition was in session. The Vrethan aggregate was consolidating its forces for the final extraction phase, and the human fleet, for the first time in its existence, was complete. The question isn't whether we act. The question is how. The Vrethan have 340 capital ships in the system, Okonkwo said, plus 47 orbital battle stations around their core worlds. Our simulations put the probability of success for a frontal assault at 73%, Park said. 73% isn't bad, someone in the room said. 73% means that in more than a quarter of the simulated scenarios, we fail, Sarah said. And if we fail, there is no second chance. We don't have the resources for another fleet. We don't have the time for another attempt." She paused. "We need 90% or more, which means we need something they don't expect." Maya Chen cleared her throat. The 2-second delay made the sound arrive at a slightly jarring moment. "I have an idea," she said, "but you're going to think it's insane." Sarah looked at the screen where Maya's face appeared, the background lit by the blue panels of a facility that had spent the last decade being built in secret 236,000 miles from Earth. "Chen," Sarah said, "we built a clandestine war fleet on the dark side of the moon. All our ideas are insane. Go on." And as Maya Chen began to explain, Sarah Miller looked at the holographic map of the galaxy, rotating slowly above the table, the Vrethon systems marked in red, and felt, for the first time in 18 months, something that felt like the distant but real possibility of a dawn. The thing was, the path to that dawn went through the dark heart of a civilization that had bet that humanity was domesticable. They were about to find out the cost of that bet. Maya Chen's idea was, technically speaking, absurd. She had spent the last 20 minutes explaining it with the precise calm of someone who had checked the calculations 6 times and kept finding the same impossible answer. The other commanders listened in growing silence, and Sarah noticed their expressions shifting gradually from skepticism to something more complicated. The specific look of someone being forced to consider that the absurd might be true. "The Vrethon will expect an attack through the ecliptic plane," Maya said. The screen behind her showed a 3-dimensional map of the enemy star system, with standard approach vectors drawn in orange. It's how everyone attacks. It's how physics works. It's how standard warp drives work. It's how 70,000 years of galactic warfare have been fought. You drop out of hyperspace. You align your bow with the target. You move forward. "This isn't a critique of physics, Chen," Commander Okonkwo said. "No, it's an observation about assumptions," she replied. "The Vrethon have their shields and weapons calibrated for attacks coming from a 90-degree cone aligned with the ecliptic plane of each system. That's how their military doctrine works. That's how everyone's military doctrine works." A pause. "Except ours, because ours was developed by people who knew they'd have to compensate for numerical superiority with creativity." Sarah crossed her arms. "Go on. The quantum warp drives we installed in our ships don't work like conventional warp drives. Conventional drives need gravitational alignment to calculate the exit point. That's why you always exit on the ecliptic plane. You're essentially using the system's gravity as a rail." Maya paused. "We don't use rails." The silence in the room was of a different quality. "How different?" Park asked. "We can exit warp space at any vector. Above, below, perpendicular to the ecliptic plane. Any angle we want." Maya Chen smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had spent 8 years solving a problem no one believed was solvable. "We can attack from below." The holographic map on the screen behind her flickered, and the attack vectors changed. Instead of lines arriving from the ecliptic plane, new lines appeared coming in perpendicular to the Vrethon system's orbital plane, thrusting directly from the stellar South Pole, like a fist coming from underneath. "Their shields don't cover that angle," Okonkwo said, more to himself than to the group, his voice like someone doing math in his head. "Their shields don't cover that angle," Maya confirmed. "Because no one has ever attacked them from there. Because it's impossible to do with a conventional warp drive. Because they don't know we have unconventional drives." She looked directly at the camera. "They don't know we have anything. They think we're dead." The meeting lasted another 4 hours. By the end of it, there was a plan. Not a perfect plan, not a plan without risk, but a plan with a probability of success above 87% in the best simulations and above 78% in the most pessimistic ones. For an operation proposing to attack the home system of a stellar civilization with a fleet that technically didn't exist until 48 hours ago, Sarah considered those numbers acceptable. What she didn't say And what everyone in the room likely knew was that the numbers didn't matter as much as the fact that there was no alternative. The coalition would keep deliberating, the Vrathan would keep advancing, and every day that passed was one day less for the 49 billion humans who had survived. Sarah spent the next 6 hours in constant motion, from the bunker to the comms room, from the comms room to the intelligence center, from the intelligence center back to the bunker. She signed off on activations, approved crew assignments, reviewed readiness reports. At 4:23 p.m., Colonel Reed caught up with her with a message she wasn't expecting. "Admiral, we have an external contact. It's not Vrathan." Sarah stopped in the hallway. "Coalition?" "No." Reed hesitated in a way that was unusual for him. "It's a private transmission, Thalassari encryption, but non-governmental. The origin points to a small ship, messenger class, in stationary orbit above the South Pole." A pause. "They're asking to speak with the human commander, specifically you." Sarah processed this. A Thalassari ship, non-governmental in private orbit, asking for personal contact in the middle of a war. "Put it in the secure room," she said. The secure room of Bunker Zeta 7 was an 85-square-foot chamber lined with material that blocked all electromagnetic emissions, with 12-inch concrete walls reinforced with a ceramic compound Engineer Chen had developed as a byproduct of ship hull research. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a compact holographic system. Nothing else. The figure that materialized in the holographic projection was Thalassari, but different from Ambassador Quelix Varan. Younger, if young was the right term for a species that lived an average of 360 years. Her bluish skin had darker tones, almost indigo, and her 4 eyes moved with a restlessness that Sarah, after 40 years of studying alien communication, interpreted as anxiety. "Admiral Miller," the figure said, in English, not through the universal translator, in real English, with a heavy but intelligible accent. "My name is Aelith Kara. I am a research associate at the Institute for Comparative Species Studies on Thalassar Prime. I do not represent the government. I represent only myself." Sarah sat in the chair. "You speak English. I have studied human communication for 16 years. It is one of my specialties." Her eyes shifted. "I am here because what is happening to Earth is wrong, and because my government and the coalition are not going to do anything about it. We already know that." "What you don't know," Aelith Kara said, "is that there are factions within the Coalition Council that are actively facilitating the Vrathan aggregate. Not just neglecting you. Facilitating. There are at least 3 member species that have resource-sharing agreements with the Vrathan, contingent on the success of the operation in your solar system." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Do you have proof of this?" "I do." The alien figure held out a device Sarah didn't recognize, and a data file began transmitting through the channel. Transaction records, intercepted communications, minutes from closed council meetings. This won't change what the coalition decides. Not before it's too late. But it will change what you can do with that information afterward. "If there is an afterward," Sarah said. "There will be," Aelith Kara said. And there was something in the way she said it, with a specific certainty that didn't match a junior researcher transmitting from a private messenger ship, that made Sarah wonder how much this young Thalassari scientist really knew about what humanity was preparing. "Admiral, I can do one more thing for you. There are Vrathan shield patterns and communication frequencies that are not in standard intelligence dossiers. I can transmit them." "Why would you do this?" The question was genuine. Sarah needed to understand the motivation before trusting the information. Aelith Kara was quiet for a moment. When she answered, there was something in her voice that the translator rendered as sadness, but Sarah thought it was more accurate to describe it as shame. "Because I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the cognitive and ethical development of Phase 2 species," she said. "Humanity was my central object of study. I spent 12 years documenting how you deal with trauma, loss, injustice, how you rebuild, how you refuse to give up even when every variable suggests that giving up is the only rational choice. A pause. My government read my work and decided that, despite my conclusions, you were expendable. I disagree. And when I am forced to choose between my career and my conviction, I choose my conviction. Sarah looked at the holographic figure for a long moment. "Read," she said, without taking her eyes off Aelith Kara. "Start verifying the received data files." "Already on it, Admiral." "Dr. Aelith Kara," Sarah said, "how long can you stay in orbit? My ship has 60 days of autonomy. Stay." Sarah stood up. "You might be useful, and if what you brought is real, humanity owes you a debt we intend to honor." Aelith Kara bowed her head in a way that Sarah, after years of study, recognized as the equivalent of a respectful nod. "It is not a debt," the Thalassari researcher said. "It is the right thing to do." Sarah cut the transmission and stood for a moment in the silent room, thinking about doctoral dissertations and species that refuse to give up when all variables suggest otherwise. Then she left the secure room and went back to work. There was a fleet to launch. The first time Captain Leo Vasquez saw the full Lazarus fleet, he was speechless for 42 seconds. He had counted afterward, because he was the kind of person who counted things like that. 42 seconds of absolute silence, which was a considerable amount of time when you were sitting in the command seat of a 1,250-foot-long warship, surrounded by a crew of 180 people who were also silent, staring through the viewports at the same thing he was. The fleet occupied a volume of space on the dark side of the moon that, from the right angle, blocked half the star field. 1,400 ships, ranging in size from 160-foot interceptors to the 10 combat carriers, each over a mile long, that formed the core of the formation, all painted in matte black with radiation heat sinks that made them nearly invisible to any passive sensor, all built in silence by human hands over 14 years of secrecy that had required a level of collective commitment that was likely unique in the history of the species. Leo was the captain of the Silent Resistance, one of the 200 medium cruisers that formed the second attack tier. His crew was composed of volunteers from 16 countries, all between the ages of 22 and 41, all with at least one personal loss from the kinetic bombardments. He hadn't done this research officially. It was simply what he had discovered in the 6 months he had commanded the ship. In conversations in the mess hall and during the long hours of waiting between training exercises. Everyone had lost someone. It was, he thought sometimes, the kind of thing that should be devastating. And it was. But there was also something else. Something that coexisted with the weight of grief in a way that Leo thought would be impossible to explain to any being of another species. It was clarity, the absence of ambiguity, the absolute and unequivocal certainty that you knew exactly why you were doing what you were doing, and that it was enough to keep you going. "Captain," said Lieutenant Noah Levi, his communications officer, "we've received the general activation transmission. Authentication code confirmed. It's real. How long until the jump window?" 18 hours. Leo looked at the fleet through the viewport for a few more seconds. Then he turned forward. "Begin pre-launch protocols." 18 hours away from Leo Vasquez and the Silent Resistance, Admiral Sarah Miller was at what had been designated as the Forward Command Center, actually a facility carved inside a 460-foot diameter asteroid in the inner belt, which had served for the last 3 years as the coordination post for the Lazarus Protocol. It was much less dramatic than it sounded. The interior of the asteroid was a series of bare metal corridors with LED lighting and the constant hum of life support systems. There were 17 people in the center besides Sarah, all specialists in different aspects of the operation that was about to begin. Maya Chen was physically present for the first time, having arrived from the lunar facility in a compact shuttle that fit inside a modest asteroid bay. Maya was 42, her black hair cut short for practical convenience, and she wore the permanently distracted expression of someone tracking multiple streams of thought simultaneously. She had spent the last 14 hours personally checking every quantum warp drive system on the 10 carriers, one by one, because she was the engineer who had developed those engines, and there was no one in the cosmos she trusted more to verify her work than herself. It wasn't arrogance, it was simply precision. "The data the Thalassari researcher brought is good," she said, without preamble, as Sarah entered the briefing room. "Reed has already incorporated the shield frequencies into every ship's targeting matrix. It increased our defense penetration probability by about 12%. 12% is substantial. 12% is the difference between 91% and 79% in the most pessimistic simulations." Maya placed a data pad on the table. "But there's something else. One of the frequencies Aelith Kara brought isn't a shield pattern. It's a communication code used internally by the Vrethon command hierarchy during combat operations." Sarah looked at her. "We can monitor them in real time during the attack. More than that." Maya crossed her arms. "I can build a specific translator for that protocol. If I have 11 more hours, you have 8. "Perfect," Maya said, with the tone of someone who had just been given exactly the kind of challenge that made her work best. Over the next 11 hours, the Forward Command Center operated with the calm intensity of an organism that had been trained for this for years and knew exactly what it needed to do. Sarah moved from station to station, listening to reports, making adjustments, approving decisions. Dr. Aelith Kara, via the secure comm link from her ship in lunar orbit, provided cultural and historical context about the Vrethon that complemented the intelligence dossiers in unexpectedly useful ways. The Vrethon have a concept we could roughly translate as the completed victory, Aelith Kara said during one of these sessions. It is a collective mental state that takes effect when a campaign is sufficiently advanced that the conclusion is considered a formality. They believe they are in that state now regarding Earth. It affects their protocols. When a species is in completed victory, the Vrethon reduce the intensity of their surveillance patterns because they consider the effort costly and unnecessary. They're less vigilant because they think they've already won, Sarah said. Much less vigilant. There is likely a 35% difference in sensor coverage density compared to a standard active combat operation. Sarah logged that mentally and added it to the final briefing she was preparing. 5 hours before launch, she gathered the captains of all the ships in a simultaneous holographic conference. There were 142 points of light in the projection, each representing a ship and its crew, spread across the dark space of the inner solar system in positions that looked random but had been calculated to minimize their joint sensor signature. Sarah looked at the faces. Many of them she knew. Others were names in dossiers that had become voices in training meetings. All were humans who had decided, for individual and specific reasons she could never fully understand, that they were willing to do this. "I'll be brief," she said. "Everyone knows the plan. Everyone has spent years training for this moment. What I want to say now isn't operational." She paused. "Over the last 18 months, the galaxy bet that we would surrender. That after a sufficiently severe blow, humanity would do what primitive species are supposed to do: shrink, beg, and accept the terms offered to us." A pause. "They were wrong, and we are going to prove that today." Silence in the conference. "But I want to be clear about what we are doing and what we aren't," Sarah continued. "We aren't going out to win a war. We are going out to end one. There is a fundamental difference. A war aims for domination. What we are doing today aims for deterrence. Our targets are exclusively military: warships, battle stations, command facilities. No civilian populations, no essential infrastructure. We are not what they are." A final pause. "We have never been what they are, and we aren't going to start now." She let that sink in for 3 seconds. "Prepare your crews. In 5 hours, the window opens. Radio silence protocols until the warp exit point. After that, we're going to do what human beings do when pushed beyond the tolerable. She looked at the 142 points of light. We improvise, we adapt, and we persevere. Good luck. Bring your crews home. The conference ended. Sarah stood alone in the empty briefing room for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a faded photograph she had carried for 18 months. Herself, with her hair still long and a carefree expression she barely recognized as her own, along with 2 brothers and a 6-year-old niece on a nameless beach. The kinetic bombardment had hit that coast. The 4 of them were part of the 2-3 billion. She looked at the photograph for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she put it back in her pocket, left the room, and returned to the command center. There was a star system to visit. Quantum warp drives didn't make a sound. That was one of the first things pilots had to learn. Because intuition said that something as violent as folding space-time should produce some sound, some vibration, some sensory signal that reality was being, technically speaking, folded in half. But there was nothing, just an instant where you were here, and another instant where you were there, and between those 2 instants existed a gap that the human brain filled with nothing, because there was nothing to fill it with. What there was the arrival. The silent resistance dropped out of warp space 335,000 miles below the ecliptic plane of the Vrethon system, exactly where the simulations had specified, and the universe around Captain Leo Vasquez exploded into data. "Sensors online," said the systems officer, Lieutenant Ria Patel, her voice controlled by training. "Confirming position. We are at the south vector. Distance to primary target 18.6 astronomical units. Contact with the formation? Confirming 72 other cruisers in the sector, Captain. The Lazarus fleet is complete in our zone." Leo looked through the viewport and saw nothing. Exactly what they were supposed to see. The fleet was invisible. Each ship with its heat and radiation sinks active, each engine in minimum mode, every non-essential system shut down. They were ghosts in the dark space below a solar system that didn't know it was about to be visited. "How much longer?" Lieutenant Levi asked, more to herself than to anyone. "Until the attack window?" Leo checked the chrono. 19 minutes. Those 19 minutes were the longest of his life, and Leo had lived through some long minutes. He spent most of them standing, watching the sensor screens, drinking the last cup of coffee he had brewed before the jump, and going through the mental checklist he repeated like a mantra whenever he needed to keep a cool head. It was mess hall machine coffee, weak and slightly bitter, and it was absolutely delicious. This was one of the facts about human beings that continued to fascinate Dr. Alith Kara in her research. The human capacity to find genuine pleasure in small, imperfect things in the midst of extreme stress. She had included an entire chapter on it in her dissertation. The Vrethon, who drank only fluids with specific metabolic functions, would find the concept of coffee completely incomprehensible. Leo thought about that while he drank and decided it was a useful piece of information to have. At the Forward Command Center, Admiral Miller followed the formation through the compiled sensor feed, watching the points of light from the ships appear on the 3-dimensional map of the Vrethon system like a new and unexpected constellation rising from the enemy system's south pole. Alith Kara's transmission arrived with a communication delay of 2 minutes and 43 seconds. "The Vrethon patrol sensors haven't detected them," the researcher said. "I confirm an absence of alert responses on the channels I am monitoring." Maya Chen, beside Sarah, whispered, "The syncs are working." "So far," Sarah said. "Yes," Maya agreed, without the slightest defensiveness. It was a factual observation, not a critique. So far was exactly so far. Everything would change in 16 minutes. The attack window had been calculated to coincide with what intelligence identified as the period of lowest activity in Vrethon surveillance patterns. In the species' circadian rhythm, which operated with activity and rest cycles different from humans, there was a window of approximately 40 minutes every 22 hours where response patterns were statistically slower. It was the functional equivalent of attacking at 3 in the morning, except on an interstellar scale and with significantly greater consequences. Admiral, it was Reed, from one of the monitoring stations. We're starting to pick up transmissions on the Vrethon command protocol. Chen's translator is working. What are they saying? Routine communications so far. Shift reports, position confirmations. A pause. Nothing to suggest they know they have company. Sarah looked at the chrono. 11 minutes. 8 minutes from the attack window, Leo received a signal on the secure channel that wasn't in the script. It was encoded on a personal frequency intended specifically for the silent resistance, and when he decoded it, he realized it came from the forward command center. From the Admiral herself. The message was short. Vasquez, there is a last-minute change in your sector. Detail to follow. It isn't mission critical, but it is important. I trust you to execute. He read the detail. Read it again. Then he called his navigation officer, Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka. Lieutenant, we're going to need to adjust our approach trajectory by 15 degrees on the lateral axis. Tanaka looked at him. That puts us outside the main formation. Only temporarily. We have a secondary target that needs to be secured before the main sequence. Tanaka processed this for a second, checked the data Leo had forwarded to her station, and nodded. I can do that. I know you can. Leo turned forward. 6 minutes. Ready the weapon systems. What Sarah had discovered 6 hours before launch, through Aelith Kara's data, was that the Vrethon system contained something intelligence had cataloged as a resource processing facility, but which internal Vrethon communications called something the translator rendered as a collected specimen depot. The collected specimens were biologically organic. Humanity had spent 18 months believing the Vrethon were simply an expansionist aggressor interested in minerals and strategic position. What Aelith Kara's data revealed was that the operation in the solar system had an additional component. The collection of biological specimens from various species in previously conquered systems, kept in observation facilities in the aggregate's core worlds. They weren't human, as far as she could determine from the data. The species listed were all Vrethon designations she couldn't identify with certainty. But they were intelligent organics, kept in observation facilities inside the system the Lazarus fleet was about to attack. The modification Sarah had made was to add a specific protocol. The silent resistance and 2 support ships that would receive precise coordinates would be tasked with identifying and securing the observation facility before the Vrethon could take any action inside it. It was an operational complication. It diverted 3 ships from the main sequence for approximately 40 minutes. It increased the risk for those 3 crews. Sarah had made the decision without hesitation, because leaving intelligent beings behind inside a system that was about to be attacked wasn't something she did, regardless of the operational cost. That didn't need an explanation either. It was simply what human beings did. The window opened at 4:17 a.m., forward command time. The Lazarus fleet moved as a single organism. There was no attack signal, no warning transmission, none of the military rituals many galactic civilizations practiced before a confrontation. There was only the silent movement of 1,400 ships emerging from the shadow of dark space and beginning to accelerate toward the Vrethon system from an angle no defense system in that system had been designed to cover. The first warning the Vrethon received was when the human ships cut the system's external communications, not by destroying them, but by jamming them, using the frequency protocol Aelith Kara had provided to flood the channels with targeted interference. In 4 seconds, the Vrethon aggregate became communicationally isolated from the rest of the galaxy. The second warning was the appearance on the sensor contacts. In the command center, Ellen Vance listened to the Vrethon transmissions being translated in real time by Sarah's system. The translation was imperfect, a rough approximation, but it was enough. She could hear the confusion turning into alarm, then into something the translator rendered as parameter dissonance, which she interpreted as the Vrethan expression for "this is not possible." "Admiral," Webb said, "the first wave is within engagement range. Confirm the position of the silent resistance, diverting to the observation facility coordinates. Within parameters." Elena looked at the map. 1,397 ships continued their advance. 3 were heading elsewhere. "Let it begin," she said. The space around the Vrethan system came alive with energy. The battle for the Vrethan system lasted 19 hours, 42 minutes, and 31 seconds. Elena knew the exact time because there had been a timer running in the upper left corner of the command center's main screen from the moment the first wave entered engagement range. She had set it manually the night before because she wanted to know the cost in time. Because time was the only resource humanity had learned, in the most brutal way possible, was not renewable. The first 40 minutes were pure shock. The Vrethan were militarily competent. 47 centuries of galactic expansion had produced a refined combat doctrine, high-quality equipment, and crews with real conflict experience. Under normal circumstances, they would have been formidable adversaries. The circumstances were not normal. The human fleet had emerged from a vector that literally did not exist in Vrethan tactical models. Their targeting systems had been calibrated using the shield frequencies Aelith Kara had provided, meaning the first shots found points of vulnerability the Vrethan operators didn't even know existed. And the hulls of the human ships, developed by Sarah Chen, based on materials research applied to captured alien tech, redistributed impact energy in ways that standard Vrethan particle cannons simply weren't designed to bypass. The first 48 Vrethan ships were disabled before a single human ship took significant damage. On the Vrethan communication monitoring channel, Elena heard Sarah's rough translator converting the transmissions into something understandable. The first few hours were chaos. Commanders asking for reports that never arrived, warning systems activating in sequences that matched no known protocol, contradictory orders emanating from multiple command centers as the hierarchy tried to process an attack that shouldn't be possible. "They're trying to recalibrate the shields," Sarah said, monitoring one of the frequencies. "But they can't. The interference patterns we're sending are within their recalibration band. How long before they find a workaround?" "Estimated 3 to 4 hours to bypass the basic interference. For the specific shield frequency vulnerability?" Sarah paused. "I have no way to estimate. They've never seen this kind of targeting before. They'll need to understand what's happening before they can fix it. 3 to 4 hours was more than enough time." The silent resistance reached the observation facility 57 minutes after the main engagement began, with 2 support ships on its flanks and the communication system configured to transmit on every frequency the universal system recognized. Leo Miller spent those 57 minutes doing the thing Admiral Vance hadn't explicitly specified, but that he understood was implicit in the nature of the mission, preparing his crew for an operation that was simultaneously military and a rescue, requiring 2 completely different mindsets to function at once. "When we get within range of the facility," he told the 180 crew members over the internal comms, "our primary objective is to ensure that nothing inside is compromised. That means before we open any compartment or establish any contact, we ensure the area is secure. Medics to the docking bay. All biocontainment protocols active." A pause. "We don't know what we're going to find in there. It could be anything. Keep your heads cool and report everything to me." The observation facility was smaller than the dossier suggested. A 4-story cylindrical structure connected to an artificial asteroid, with the exterior revealing habitat accommodations in 3 separate modules. It was aseptic and functional, built with the aesthetic Leo had learned to associate with Vrethan infrastructure, efficient, practical, and completely indifferent to the comfort of anyone who wasn't Vrethan. As the silent resistance moved into cover position and the boarding teams departed in compact auxiliary ships, Leo stayed in the command seat and monitored the feed. What the team cameras showed in the first 15 minutes were sealed containment modules, life support systems in normal operation, and biometric signals from multiple living organisms. "Captain," said the boarding team leader, Sergeant Emeka Osei, "we're in the central module. We have confirmation of life in 32 individual compartments. Vital signs are stable. Species? Working on it." A long pause. "We're reading. At least 6 distinct biological profiles. None of them are human." Another pause. "But they're all sapient. Neural activity patterns are consistent with high-level cognition." Leo was quiet for a moment. "Open the compartments," he said, carefully. "And someone find me the xenobiologist. At the forward command center." The first reports from the main operation arrived in minute-long intervals. Elena processed each one with the efficiency developed over 18 months of constant crisis. Filter the essentials, identify deviations from the plan, adjust when necessary, trust the crews for the rest. Most of the battle was going within parameters. The Vrethon orbital battle stations at the core worlds were being engaged by the second wave, which had entered range with precise coordination after the first wave established sensor suppression. There were losses. She didn't delude herself about that. Some human ships had taken real damage, and some of those had injured crew. 3 ships from the second wave had been pulled from active combat due to critical damage to their propulsion systems. One ship, the Persistent Vector, had suffered a cascading power failure that left it adrift for 40 minutes before the nearest rescue ship arrived. No ship had been destroyed. Not yet. Admiral. It was Webb. Incoming transmission on the Vrethon command channel. Translation in progress. "What transmission?" "It's for our fleet. They're transmitting specifically to us." Elena stepped closer to the monitoring station. On the screen, the translated text was being built word by word as Sarah's system processed the signal. The translation was rough, imprecise in its nuances, but the meaning was clear. "Unknown entity. Identify yourselves. This attack violates the non-aggression statutes of the Galactic Coalition. Cease engagement immediately or the Coalition will be notified and measures will be taken." Leo, who was monitoring the same channel aboard the Silent Resistance, heard this and felt something he didn't normally allow himself, an urge to laugh. Elena didn't laugh, but the muscles around her eyes moved in a specific way that, in someone who smiled more often, would have been the precursor to a grin. She didn't respond to the Vrethon transmission immediately. She let 4 minutes pass as she continued to monitor the unfolding battle. Then, when the second wave confirmed they had neutralized 7 of the 47 battle stations and that organized Vrethon resistance was beginning to fragment, she replied, "Vrethon Aggregate. This is Admiral Elena Vance of the United Earth Force. You attacked our world without a declaration of war, without warning, and without legal justification within the system you claim to defend. You killed 2,300,000,000 of our people. You declared your intention to kill the rest." A deliberate pause. "We are not violating Coalition statutes. The Coalition can take note." She cut the channel. The 17th hour of the battle was the hardest. The Vrethon had found a partial solution to the shield frequency vulnerability, as Sarah had predicted, and the resistance had stiffened. 2 human ships were destroyed, the Constant Blade and the Guardian of the Fourth, with total loss of crew. A third, the Resolute Horizon, suffered critical damage but managed to retreat out of combat range with 94 surviving crew members out of 117. Elena received these reports the same way she received all the others. She processed them, adjusted, and moved on. But she recorded every ship name and crew number in a memory that discarded nothing. This was another fact about humans that Aelith Kara had documented in her dissertation. The capacity to maintain functional operational presence while carrying the accumulated weight of grief. Other species tended to have more binary responses to trauma, which made them more predictable under pressure. Humans did something more complex. They kept going and carried the cost at the same time. It was exhausting. It was effective. In the 19th hour, Frethan's Supreme Command issued a different transmission. This time, it wasn't addressed to the human fleet. It was on the internal channels that Sarah's system monitored, and what it said, roughly translated, was requesting cessation conditions. Elena looked at Webb. Verify if it's real. Verifying. A 30-second pause. It's real, Admiral. Origin confirmed from the Retaliation Supreme Operations Council. It's not a signal trick. She stared at the map for a long moment. Connect me. The face that appeared on the holographic projection was Vrethan, which meant it was a 7-foot-tall reptilian life form with rust-colored scales and vertical slit pupils. The title the translation system processed was something equivalent to Supreme Commander of Operations, and there was an expression on him that Leo Miller, if he had been present, would have recognized as someone doing math that didn't result in the number they expected. Human Admiral, the Supreme Commander said, and the translator turned the voice into something recognizable. You attacked with unregistered technology and undocumented tactics. We request to understand which entity we are communicating with. With Earth, Elena said. Just Earth. A silence on the channel. You. We're just Earth. We are Earth, Elena said. And we are still here. More silence. And then, slowly, the Vrethan Supreme Commander began to transmit what the translation system identified as preliminary cessation terms. Elena listened to them, and she began to formulate her response. Elena's ultimatum had 3 points. She had prepared them mentally over the last 19 hours as the battle unfolded, not because she knew for sure she would reach this moment, but because the Lazarus Protocol had taught her, above all, that you plan for the result you want and prepare contingencies for everything else. The result she wanted was on the table now, and she presented it without preamble, without the ceremonial rhetoric that, according to the dossiers, the Vrethan expected from interlocutors in a position of strength. First, the Vrethan fleet would withdraw completely from the solar system and a radius of 15 astronomical units around it, immediately and verifiably. Second, the Vrethan aggregate would hand over all data on technologies, routes, and alliances used in the preparation of the attack on Earth for use by the Galactic Coalition investigation, which would be receiving documentation on the complicity of member species in the conflict, courtesy of Aelith Kara's archives. Third, the Vrethan aggregate would begin a process of economic reconstruction for the targeted worlds, administered by a neutral entity which would last no less than 40 galactic years. We do not demand slavery, Elena said, looking at the projection of the Supreme Commander. We do not demand territory, we do not demand the end of your civilization, and we do not demand punishment beyond what is here. Rebuild. Rebuild without forced expansion, without the extermination of species considered inferior, without the kind of calculation that brought you here. A pause. You have 18 hours to accept. If you do not, we resume the engagement. The Supreme Commander looked at her for a long moment. Your civilization is too young for this kind of power. Every civilization starts young, Elena said. The question is how you choose to grow. She ended the transmission. Over the next 18 hours, the Forward Command Center entered a different state. The frantic pace of battle had been replaced by something heavier and quieter. The diplomatic weight, tempered by the awareness that there were damaged ships in the outer space of the Vrethan system awaiting authorization for withdrawal, wounded being treated on board, and 2 ships that no longer existed. Aelith Kara transmitted at 4:00 a.m. Command Center time. The files I sent to the Coalition have arrived, she said. There is an emergency session scheduled for tomorrow. Ambassador Quelix Varun has asked to speak with me personally. A pause. I think they'll want to know if what you did has legal precedent. Does it? Elena asked. Not clearly. but there is an interpretation of the Coalition's Articles of Foundation that allows a species in a state of undeclared war to take defensive measures within the limits of the aggressor system if they can demonstrate that all alternatives were exhausted. Aelith Kara tilted her head. You tried diplomatic channels. You were ignored. The attack continued. There is an argument to be made. I need you to make it. I was already planning on it, the Talisari researcher said, with a quiet confidence Elena had learned to recognize as her trademark. Admiral, may I ask you something? You may. The observation facility. I heard from the report that your ship rescued. What was in there? Elena paused. She had received Leo Miller's full report 4 hours earlier. She had read every line twice. 32 sapient organisms from 6 distinct species. 3 of the species are not in any Coalition catalog we have access to. She paused. The other 3 are species the Coalition lists as extinct. Silence on the channel. Extinct, Aelith Kara repeated softly. Probably the last representatives of their species, kept under observation. Elena let the weight of that settle. The Vrethon didn't kill them, they just collected them, like samples. What are you going to do with them? Whatever we can. Chief Medical Officer Kowalski is aboard the Silent Resistance. She's spent the last 14 hours establishing basic communication with the 3 cataloged species. The other 3? Elena paused. We're working on it. It's possible we'll never achieve fluent communication. It's possible we'll never fully know what they went through in there. A longer pause. But they are alive, and we didn't leave them there. Another pause on the channel. That goes into the Coalition report too, Aelith Kara said. That will matter. Galactically, the Vrethon accepted the ultimatum at 2:11 p.m. The withdrawal began and was verified within 48 hours. Confirmed by independent sensors the Admiral had positioned before starting the engagement, because Elena Vance was not the type of person to accept declarations without verification. The data handover process took 3 weeks and was mediated by a neutral Talisari arbiter Aelith Kara had personally identified and contacted. The Galactic Coalition issued a formal statement 12 days after the cessation. It was a dense 40-page legal document that, distilled into common language, said that the human action had been technically within defensible interpretations of the Articles of Foundation, that the complicity of the 3 member species would be investigated, and that the process for Earth's admission as a full member would be fast-tracked. The seat on the Coalition Council reached Earth in the form of a formal invitation 6 weeks later. Elena read it. Then she wrote the response. Earth thanked them for the invitation and respectfully declined. Humanity had observed the functioning of the Coalition Council for 41 years and had concluded that participating in a structure that had taken 18 months to issue notes of concern while billions died would not be a productive use of its resources. Instead, Earth proposed the formation of the Sovereignty Pact, an alternative structure focused on the protection of developing species and the creation of rapid response mechanisms against undeclared aggression. The invitation to the pact was open. The conditions were simple: a commitment to effective response, not just symbolic, to violations of the sovereignty of smaller species. No 50-cycle admission bureaucracy, no neutrality during extinctions. 18 species responded positively in the first 4 weeks. The transmission of the names lasted 9 days. It was a continuous radio and tachyonic feed broadcast on every frequency that available human and alien technology could reach. There was no music, no narration, no context. Just names, one by one, read by volunteers in every human language that had ever existed, in 8-hour shifts, without stopping. It was Leo Miller's project. He had proposed the idea to Elena 3 days before the cessation in a short message from the Silent Resistance channel. Admiral, when this is over, we need to read the names, all of them, so the galaxy hears. She had approved it without hesitation. 2,300,000,000 names. In the simple math of time and speaking speed, It was impossible. But humanity had learned over the last 18 months that impossible was often a matter of perspective and how many people were willing to work together. They created a network. Volunteers in every surviving bunker, every space station, every underground facility. Each person who read a name passed it to the next reader and so on, in an unbroken chain. There was something ritualistic about it that needed no explanation. Each name was a shared weight, and by sharing it, it became bearable. The transmission reached star systems 12 light-years away. Aelith Kara heard part of it in her ship from lunar orbit. She couldn't understand the words of the languages she didn't know, but she understood what it was. She documented the transmission in her research journal with a note that simply said, "No species I have ever studied has done this. None." On the 9th day, the last name was read. The transmission ceased. And then there was silence for exactly 3 minutes, a silence that the human fleet distributed across the solar system and beyond held collectively, because someone had suggested it, and the suggestion had spread without anyone needing to give an order. Then, life began again. 6 months later, Elena Vance was sitting in a modified shipping container that served as a temporary office on the surface of what had once been Chicago. There was a window in the container, and through it, she saw the landscape of reconstruction that had become the permanent backdrop of her life. Cranes, scaffolding, rows of temporary housing modules, people moving with the particular determination of those who don't have the luxury of doing things slowly. There were also birds. A family of robins had established territory in a patch of cleared ground 50 yards away, and sometimes, in the late afternoon, Elena heard them. She was rereading for the 3rd time a report that had arrived from the xenobiology team, working with the 32 organisms rescued from the Vrethon facility, when there was a knock on the container door. "Come in." It was Leo Miller. He had been promoted to Commodore 3 weeks earlier by a unanimous vote of the Officers' Council, a process that had taken approximately 40 minutes because no one had objected and most of the time had been spent checking the paperwork. He had the same tired eyes everyone had, the same way of walking that the war had left as a permanent mark, and in his hand he had 2 cups of coffee. He put one on Elena's desk without asking permission. She accepted it the same way. "The xenobiology report," she said without preamble. "I know." He sat in the only other chair. "I read it this morning. The species they're tentatively calling Species C has established full-context communication with Dr. Kowalski. They can express abstract concepts now." The first thing they expressed? I read it. A pause. They asked why we saved them. Elena looked at her coffee cup. What did Kowalski say? The truth. That we found them, that they were alive, and that we don't leave living beings behind. Silence between the two for a moment. And Species C accepted that answer? It took 2 days of additional communication for them to believe it was the full answer. They kept waiting for more context. Some strategic reason, some benefit, some trade calculation. Leo looked out the window at the robins on the cleared ground. When they finally believed there was no other reason, just that we found them and saved them, one of the individuals did the communicative equivalent of falling silent for 12 hours. Processing. That's what Kowalski thinks. And then when they went back to communicating, they said something she's still trying to translate accurately. The best she has so far is, "You are the kind of thing the galaxy needed to exist." Elena stared out the window for a long moment. Outside, Chicago was being rebuilt. It was a slow, imperfect process, full of logistical and political and human complications that the Lazarus fleet had been completely inadequate to solve, because no fleet is adequate to rebuild what was lost. But it was happening. And everywhere on the planet, the same thing was happening, at the pace that resources and will allowed. "We're going to need a name," Elena said, eventually. "For Species C? For the Pact? For what we're doing here?" She looked at the report on the desk. "For what we are now, in the galaxy." Leo drank his coffee. He thought for a moment. "The galaxy already has a name for us," he said. "I heard it from Aelith Kara last week. She said that in diplomatic communications, species are referring to us by a term that translates roughly to the Sentinels of Silence, the ones who watch in the space between the stars." Elena was quiet. "It's good," she said finally. "It's what we are," he said. She looked out the window at the robins, at the cranes, at the Chicago sky that was slowly freeing itself from the haze of particles the bombardment had kicked up. She thought of the 32 organisms in a medical ship in orbit, of the 18 worlds that had said yes to the pact, of the names that had lasted 9 days, of the 2 ships that didn't come back. She thought of the Lazarus Protocol and the old professor in Geneva who had asked the right question 22 years ago. And then she picked up her coffee and finished the report, because there was a lot of work to do, and the planet didn't wait. Humanity had never expected anyone to save them, and maybe that was why it had learned, over the centuries and the losses and the new beginnings, to become exactly the kind of thing that saves. The Sentinels of Silence do not sleep. They watch, and they remember. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier. New stories of survival, ingenuity, and the absurd stubbornness of the galaxy's most unlikely species arrive every week. Because the universe is vast, and someone needs to watch the silence between the stars.